This is the second video in the economics of land use planning. In particular, we are looking at mitigating the adverse income distributional consequences of zoning. One method is to use eminent domain, the government power to take property and then use taxes and subsidies to transfer incomes or to adverse the income distributional consequences. The second is to use tradable permits and rely on the market. The idea is to tax windfalls and compensate wipeouts, or what we might want to call windfall for wipeout compensation. There are two problems. One is the identification of windfalls and wipeouts. It's a result of a separation of the direct and indirect effects of the zoning ordinance. So the direct effect of the zoning ordinance would be on land whose use is changed by the ordinance. In other words, the land that's zoned, say, to open space and that loses value. The indirect effect is on land elsewhere, not directly affected by the zoning ordinance, but whose value changes nonetheless. For example, residential properties near an open space may become somewhat less valuable due to higher traffic in the area and noise and other activity that is negative and related to, say, the open space, whereas properties 100 meters away from the open space do not experience that, and as a result, those residential properties become more valuable. The second is a principal agent problem, in that the losers are quick to identify their losses, but the gainers delay realization of their gain. They delay sale of property, for example, and they are not very helpful in trying to enable the authority to identify the gain. Timing is an important issue here. When do comparative measurements occur? So let's consider this situation here. We have land that is in use A, and if it were to be in use B, it would have a higher value. All right, this is the value in use B over time, and this is the value in A over time. Now notice here that these two are essentially parallel. So now suppose the zoning ordinance is implemented at time T1 when the value of land in agriculture is A1 and the value in use B, non-agriculture, is B1. But the assessment date occurs at a later time at T2, by which time use B is now valued at B2, whereas the agricultural value has gone up as well to A2. So the correct measure is this distance from B1 minus A1 at the time of the ordinance, or if we have the information, that is, or B2 minus A2. The incorrect measure would be the price of use B, or what use B is at time T2 minus what the agricultural value was at time A1. That would be the wrong measure. So if we do shift land from A to B, then the correct windfall measure is B1 minus A1 or B2 minus A2, depending on the time when it is measured. However, zoning is meant to enhance land use values. So when we change from agriculture, let's say, to, in other words, use A to use B, it is assumed that at the time of the zoning ordinance, the value of use B increases from B over time to B prime over time. So in this case, what happens is the wrong measure would certainly be B3 minus A1. It would be B1 minus A1 at time of ordinance, T1, but in this case, B2 minus A2 is the wrong measure of what the windfall would be. The correct measure of the windfall would be, as noted, B1 minus A1, or in this case, B3 minus A2 at the assessment date T2. What about the financial solvency of the windfall for wipeout compensation scheme? Even if windfalls are greater than wipeouts, it's easier to identify losers who help the authority identify their loss than gainers who delay sale and frustrate the authority. How do gainers pay except at the sale? So there's the wrong incentives here. So the financial solvency doesn't really work. All right, wipeouts do not usually equal windfalls except by chance. Now consider a system of transferable development rights. The idea is to separate the right to sell a property from the right to develop it. The rights to develop are not vested with the state, although the state is needed to set the legal framework to make trades possible. And the purpose of the system of development rights, tradable development rights, is to mitigate income distributional impacts from zoning. So it's mitigating it. It doesn't mean that all windfalls will be used to compensate all wipeouts. So suppose this whole yellow area here was unzoned land. And as a result of a state planning commission, it is now divided and zoned into the following zones. 1, agriculture. In area 2, single family dwellings. In area 3, multiple family dwellings. In area 4, commercial industrial uses. So the previous unzoned land is now zoned. Previously, all property was assumed to be the same price. So those in 1 lose value because it's now the uncertainty about what the price of land should be has been resolved. So in the previous slide we indicated that, or pardon me, in the previous videos we indicated that we had agricultural land going from $500 down to $400, say, and an increase in each of the other 3 quadrants. So those in 1 lose, but those in 4 gain the most value. With transferable development rights, every owner is given development rights. So the person in 4 may own 10 hectares, but only has enough development rights to develop, say, 2 hectares of that area. By increasing the supply of open space, so here we're postulating an increase in the supply of open space. We see here in the diagram that we have open space currently at L0, and we're proposing, or we're going to increase it to L1. The demand for open space is given by this dashed demand function. It would probably be a willingness to pay function based on non-market valuation, for example. And the price of land in urban use is given by P sub U. By assumption, we assume that it's equal to the same price as open space is before we increase the amount of open space available. So now we increase open space from L0 to L1. The price of open space falls from P0 to P1, but the price of urban land increases from PU to P prime U. The correct compensation of the loss of or the wipeout is given by A. All right, it's the amount of land in open space, the increase in open space, and then this is the reduction in the value of land. Actually, the correct, depending on who owns it, suppose that this amount of land L0 is owned by private individuals, then it would be this area, P0 minus P1 times L0, that is the correct measure of the wipeout. So now let's look at the market for urban land. So the development rights change what happens. All right, so previously the land in urban space was PU, it's gone up to P prime U, but instead of having a demand stay at DU, we use development rights to get the land demand down to D prime U. So the transferable development rights, reduce the demand function from du to d prime u. Du here is a function of the development rights. So now instead of having this area P prime U, PU, be A as the indirect windfall, it is now the green area only that's the windfall because of the development rights. So this area E refers to the payment to the development rights, or the value of the development rights, which if we go back one slide, it turns out that that area above the green area turns out to be equal to this area E. So now let's assume that we have 3 owners of 1 hectare plots, and that each of those owners has a agricultural value of land of $500. All right. Or we could say that the value of the land is $600 for person 1, $900 for person 2, and for person 3 it's $1,500. And now the land is valued in agriculture. It's put into agriculture, which means that they each have $500 worth of land, rather than the $600 that number 1 had, number 2 had $900, number 3 $1,500 on, and each of these was a 1 hectare plot. So now what we're interested in is finding out that if we reduce the value of the land, all right, into agriculture, so that the land can no longer be used in these higher use values, then what would be the required compensation? Alternatively, we could say that the land was in agriculture and we've now shifted it up into this higher valued use. So we're going to look at the compensation side. So we can compensate by area owned. So then, assuming we have we have 30 development rights that we could transfer, and the value of each is $50. We're not concerned about how that $50 was determined. So if we compensate by area owned and we give each of the owners 10 development rights, which means that we're basically giving them each $500, then the total compensation would be the $500 plus the $500 land value in agriculture. So they'd receive $1,000 each. So the number 1 would have been able to put the land into $600, something that's worth $600. So this person is overcompensated by $400 per hectare. This person by $100 per hectare, and number 3 loses $500 per hectare, because the alternative would have been that the land was used in this new value, $1,500, but is confined to stay at $500 in agriculture. So we can compensate by the land value, the new land value, $600, which means that we give this person 6, this person 9, and this person 15, because we only have 30 transferable development rights to allocate. So now the compensation is $500 plus 6 times 50, which gives 300, is $800. The compensation for person number 2 is $500 plus 9 times 50, which is $450, which gives us $950. And this one is 15 transferable development rights. That's 15 times $50 per development right is $750, plus the $500 is $1250. So this person is still undercompensated. The compensation according to opportunity cost would be the difference between these two numbers. All right, so for this number 3, it'd be $1,000. So that person would need 20 development rights, which would give them $1,000. Plus the $500 is $1,500. This person would get 8 Transferable development rights, which would be an extra 8 times 50 is 400, plus 500 is 900, and this person would get 2, which would compensate them exactly to this figure of their land value that they're not allowed to now have. Now, if we look at the extensive margin, so far we've looked at the urban rural interface. Now we want to look at the development or the agriculture nature interface. So we use agricultural programs, and we're going to look at those and land use. Notice that without agricultural programs, it's not possible to protect agricultural land using zoning ordinances such as the Agricultural Land Reserve. The main reason is fragmentation of land. In other words, properties that are in the Agricultural Land Reserve are not able to expand in size because that is not allowed under the Agricultural Land Reserve, and primarily it's impossible to expand because urban areas creep in, and the total area under the Agricultural Land Reserve in areas near urban centers is inadequate. Fragmentation also occurs because it's impossible to have more farmers come into the area, so that you become isolated as a farmer. So what kind of agricultural programs or needs are required? Well, you might need to supplement and or protect producer incomes. You might need to manage supplies. You might need to offset fragmentation and protect or offset the loss of upstream and downstream ancillary services such as farm equipment dealers, rendering plants, places where you could sell crops and that kind of thing. And you may need to support farm prices using government power income. Agricultural programs and their effects on land use can be quite damaging. Farm programs have distorted land use in various ways. Primarily, agricultural programs have subsidized production, which meant that there's increased chemical use, fertilizer use on agricultural properties, and there tends to be this monoculture occurring, and a lot of land that would otherwise have been in permanent pasture or forest is then converted into crop production. So marginal land is converted into crop production, which means that you get environmental damage and loss of marginal natural areas. So these farm programs have distorted land in various ways in Canada, the United States, and the European Union. Now, 3 policies have been implemented by various countries to address the land degradation problem, and the intent under the World Trade Organization is to decouple production from subsidies. In other words, once you subsidize agricultural producers in some way, that this does not incentivize them to produce more. Producing more implying using more fertilizer to get more yield per hectare, and or bringing marginal land into production which otherwise would not have been brought into production. So the 3 policies that I note here are: first, cross compliance. The farmer needs to implement conservation measures to be eligible for subsidies. So these conservation measures are identified by the state, by extension agents, etc. The second is specific programs that target protection of vulnerable lands. The U.S. Conservation Reserve Program is notable for doing that. Wetlands Reserve and wetlands banking programs also try to protect these marginal lands that are more vulnerable to soil erosion and that kind of thing. And in international trade negotiations, in particular the Agreement on Agriculture that was passed with the ending of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades and the beginning of the World Trade Organization, WTO. These international trade negotiations have sought to reduce programs that distort production decisions. Now, a lot of this can be found in my book, Applied Welfare Economics, Trade and Agricultural Policy Analysis, University of Toronto Press, 2020.